Is everything on here? I think it is. Cool. Good evening and shalom. Welcome to this episode here of The Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, and this is first time in like a month that we've done this. But like I was telling you guys on earlier episodes of Unapologetics, for those of you who watch that, we're going to be definitely trying to be more consistent here on these. But I'm not promising anything. I'm past the point where I'm promising stuff just because it's not fair to anyone else for me to promise stuff when I'm not good at keeping promises as it pertains to YouTube. But hopefully the goal, which of course has been the goal for some time now, is going to be to have one of these watchdogs every week on some randomly picked weekday, as well as an Unapologetics every weekend, and an Unapologetics Lite, which is going to be smaller, 30-minute and lower Unapologetics, also on the weekends, once a weekend. So hopefully we'll have 3 videos uploaded every weekend, and those of you who like the religious content, you can watch those Unapologetics. Those of you who like the political content, we of course have the Watchdogs, and I don't know, maybe you like both, who knows, right? Either way, you can watch them both. Excuse me, let me get some drink up here, coffee. At, 8:30 at night? Probably not a good idea, but anyways. So, the first thing that I want to talk about, because we're going to just jump right in, there's a lot of stuff that I want to talk about actually today, is the capitulation of many big tech companies to China and what I think about that. So we see here just one example. I chose this article because it actually goes in depth to some of the other examples as well. But as you can see by the title, there's just one example. Apple reportedly will not bid for South Park streaming rights because of China's ban on the show. Now, for those of you who do not know, South Park recently made a show. It's the second episode of what I believe is either their 23rd or 24th season. It was called Band in China, B-A-N-D, like a rock band. You can kind of see on the screen there one of the characters whose name is Butters, playing the guitar, appearing to sing some rock and roll music, heavy rock and roll music. And it was, having 2 different arcs, one of a band with another one of the characters who's Stan Marsh, and one with a basically an arc of Stan Marsh's father trying to sell marijuana in China, because and it was this whole satire of the American capitalists basically wanting to go into China and capitulate to the Chinese government as a way to get all the money that would come with the Chinese market. And it also satired the fact that the good president over there, Winnie Jinping, right, whose real name is actually Z-I, but we're going to call him Winnie Jinping because actually the satirical part here that's in the South Park episode, they decided that they were going to ban Winnie the Pooh. And why did they decide they were going to ban Winnie the Pooh? Well, because you see, some internet trolls decided they were going to compare Winnie Jinping to Winnie the Pooh, and he got all offended because he's a very little person inside, and decided, I want to ban that because, I'm a loser and can't take any sort of criticism whatsoever, even if it was a joke. So we refer to him as Winnie Jinping here. But anyways, and continue to satire all this kind of stuff. And interestingly enough, the show Banned in China got South Park banned in China, right? And this came at a very interesting time for for this episode to come out, for this show to be banned in China, considering everything that's happened recently with Google and the NBA and numerous other organizations and big tech companies, in their capitulation to the Chinese government for the purposes of trying to, get the Chinese market and the money that comes with the Chinese market. So we're going to go ahead and get into this article. I'm sorry, I'm not talking very well today. This is by Kat Tenbarge, Business Insider. Just to read the title here one more time, and of course the, links will be in the description. I am not doing so hot right now. Anyways, Apple reportedly won't bid for South Park streaming rights because of China's ban on the show. Sources familiar with the offer to buy streaming rights to South Park told Bloomberg that Apple probably won't bid for the show because its episode banned in China got the show literally banned in China. China is a major manufacturing asset for Apple, as well as a top consumer of Apple products. Viacom and South Park creators are expected to make between 450 and 500 million for the streaming rights to the long-running animated series, and as many as 6 companies are bidding, Bloomberg reports. Hulu has streamed South Park since 2015 and is still interested in retaining the series if the price doesn't go too high, while Netflix has already dropped out of the bidding. And of course, Netflix has not had South Park for quite some time now. I don't think they had it in 2014. I don't actually remember. I do remember the South Park movie was on Netflix at some point, but I'm not entirely sure when exactly that was. Nonetheless, Viacom, the owner of Comedy Central's long-running animated series South Park, is looking to sell the streaming rights to the series for between $450 and $500 million American, according to Bloomberg. Sources familiar with the bidding told Bloomberg that Apple probably won't extend a bid due to the show's recent ban in China after the second episode in season 23, banned in China, included a humorous attack on Chinese censorship. China reportedly ceased all streaming and discussion of the show on its state-controlled internet. Apple is in the midst of developing its ambitious streaming platform, Apple TV+, which is already slated with highly anticipated original content. The company relies on Chinese manufacturing for many of its products, and China makes up a great deal of its consumer base. Thus, sources told Bloomberg that it was unlikely that Apple would want to host South Park on Apple TV+. Conversely, Apple also appears to be crafting a family-friendly content selection on its streaming service, with relatively non-controversial content in general. I'm not 100% sure about that. I'm not 100%. I mean that literally in the sense that I don't actually know. But it would be interesting, definitely, to see in that particular sense. I know that a lot of people claim to have family-friendly content in a lot of different senses. Disney, Netflix, things like that, and then they turn out really not to. So it'd be interesting to see if Apple TV Plus is actually wanting to have non-controversial content, or if that's just an excuse here to not want South Park on the show, which is, of course, their right and prerogative. It's just interesting because of the political ramifications around the whole censorship here in China. Bloomberg also reports that as many as 6 streaming services are in the running to acquire South Park. The show has been available to stream on Hulu since 2015, and Hulu is interested in retaining the show as long as it does not become too expensive. Meanwhile, Netflix has dropped out of negotiation for South Park, according to Bloomberg, but NBC's Peacock and HBO's Max are both angling for the series. After South Park made fun of China's censorship of Western entertainment, resulting in its apparent ban, it posted a sarcastic apology that drew on the recent NBA-China clash over an... excuse me, let me restart this. It posted a sarcastic apology that drew on the recent NBA-China clash over an NBA executive's endorsement of the Hong Kong protests. The show also mocked LeBron James for his comments on the incident in another episode and declared F the Chinese government. Representatives for Apple didn't immediately respond to Business Insider's request for comment. And of course, the main issue that South Park is taking here, that a lot of people are taking with China in this particular regard, is the capitulation of big business and entertainment to the Chinese government for the purposes of trying to get rich, basically, off of the Chinese market. It's something that has been very well documented in a lot of different companies at this point. For example, we saw Google's Chinese version of Google, right, of its search engine in Dragonfly. And Dragonfly, of course, was going to be curated in such a way that, underground churches, for example, and underground Falun Gong groups, and references to the Tiananmen Square, and references to what's going on with the, what are they called? Uyghurs, I think, is how you pronounce it. The Muslims, basically, in the northwestern provinces of China. And basically just going through the lines of trying to, censor different things that the Chinese government had done. We have also, of course, seen the NBA, as was mentioned in here, defending, actually, quite surprisingly, China quite frequently, to say the least. We saw James Harden say that he loves China and everything that China is about. We saw that Steve Kerr said that people in China were never asking me why so many Americans were being gunned down in the middle of schools and stuff like that. We, of course, heard LeBron James saying that, he wasn't going to get political about it. It wasn't his place. I think the only reasonable thing that I actually heard about it in this regard was Steph Curry said that he really didn't know anything about it, and that's definitely something that is understandable. If you don't know anything about it, you shouldn't comment on it. But nonetheless, it is something that's pretty interesting because it's not just like it's one company here. Numerous companies have been constantly capitulating to Chinese censorship, to Chinese tyrannical governance over its own people. We've obviously seen this in theological ways as well, with the Catholic Church signing their little, Sino-Vatican deal. They basically sold out not only traditionalist Catholics, but essentially all religious people who don't do so under the watchful eye of the Catholic Church, which is something that we're warning about here because I think it's going to be coming to a lot of other countries. Let me tell you what. And actually, we're going to get into a little bit later the debate that Michael Brown and Adam Green had about the Noahide laws, and I got to say that I think there's relation here in the Sino-Vatican Agreement and Noahide laws, and I think that we'll get to that. But basically, you are seeing here, beyond any shadow of a doubt, a very disturbing trend in companies basically taking cash over principle. And we see the reason why this is well, there's a few reasons, of course, why it's disturbing, but the main reason why it's disturbing is because a lot of these companies are either A, being blatantly hypocritical, right, or B, selling out a lot of their own core values. For example, with the NBA refused to go down to North Carolina and play for a while because they, or maybe it was the NCAA, I'm not sure, I think it was the NBA nonetheless, but because of the transgender bathroom bill, right? So saying that a transgender person has to use the bathroom that they are assigned biologically was enough for the NBA to say, we're good, we're done, right? And of course, we had people raising their hands for the whole hands up, don't shoot thing. And there's always been quite a bit of political involvement on the part of LeBron James, who was a campaigner for Hillary Clinton. You just go down the line with all the different things that we've had here. And yet, when it comes to China, where they are horrible to homosexual people as well as to Muslims and Christians and Falun Gong and the Hong Kong protesters and etc., all of a sudden all those principles seem to go out the window. Protesting seems to go out the window. And now we love China and everything that China's about, which I think will be a quote that'll live in infamy for quite a lot of people. It was James Harden on the Houston Rockets who said that. I mean, an utterly ridiculous thing. And Steve Kerr and LeBron James, too, being two of the most socially aware, quote-unquote, people in the modern sports world to have the comments that they made. I mean, Steve Kerr, well, they don't ask me about school shootings in China. Well, first off, that's not the government doing it. Second off, I kind of doubt that, to be honest with you, because I have a feeling the vast majority of the world looks down on the United States, to be honest with you, which I could care less about. They can look down on the United States all they would like. But nonetheless, it's a pretty consistent trend here. You know what I mean? It's a very consistent trend, and it's a disturbing trend. And it's not like just with the NBA. The company Apple here, it's a company that I've had a lot of respect for a very long time. They're definitely they're on the forefront of innovation. They completely revolutionized the world with the iPod Touch, which eventually turned into the smartphone revolution that we currently know today. And they've always prided themselves on security, right? Many of you may recall the iCloud hack of 2014, dubbed by a bunch of losers on the internet the Fappening. And Apple took that incredibly seriously. They wanted to know where the breach happened, how the breach happened, how we're going to stop it, right? Many of you may be familiar with their two-factor authentication system, which they actually were the ones who pioneered, right? Which is an incredibly secure system for your accounts. Many may also be familiar with, I can't remember, it was some terrorist group, I think it was the Boston Bomber, right? And they wanted to get into the Apple phones of the Boston Bombers. And it maybe if it's somebody else, please let me know, but I'm pretty sure it was the Boston Bombers. And Apple said, no, we're not going to let you do that. We're not going to give you a back door into our systems because we value our customers' privacy too much, right? And yet, here's Apple now saying that they're going to capitulate. And it's not necessarily a privacy thing, don't get me wrong. So it's not straight up hypocrisy and anything like that, but that they're going to capitulate to Apple or to China, right, in this way. I feel like it's kind of a betrayal of a company that has actually some very solid values, and I certainly hope that they return to that. Now, of course, if they just don't want to have content on their program or on their platform, rather, that is, not family appropriate, that's controversial, that's, saying a lot of inappropriate things and things like that, I certainly understand that. And they definitely have that right. It's their platform, it's their company. They have the right to do whatever they want. And actually, they have the right to curate it in a political way as well. To be perfectly fair about this, if they want nothing but liberal politics and movies with a liberal edge and things like that, which I'm not saying they do, but if they did, that is their right, right? PureFlix obviously has predominantly, if not entirely, Christian. And I think it is entirely, actually. I don't have a PureFlix account or anything like that, so I'm not entirely sure. But you get the point, right? Netflix obviously curates based off of the things that they approve of and disapprove of. So I'm definitely not saying that they don't have the right. And all of these companies have the right. In the case of Google's always been evil. So, I mean, they have the Don't Be Evil campaign, but that doesn't mean anything. It was just a lie. So no surprise there. But, with all of these companies, you are seeing a betrayal, in some cases, of very genuine political beliefs and philosophical beliefs on security, beliefs in human freedom, and they're doing so for a buck and to seem, socially aware, I guess. You know what I mean? There's something socially aware about wanting to be friendly with the Chinese government, I guess. I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, to continue on with China, the most recent issue that they have had has been these protests in Hong Kong. And actually, we're going to read this article a little bit later. I want to actually read this one first. From Reuters, protesters hurled petrol bombs after police fired tear gas in Hong Kong. This has been obviously an ongoing problem for quite some time. I'm actually a little bit embarrassed to say that because we haven't been on this, haven't been doing this show as often as we should be, that actually I haven't been able to talk about it, really. And so that's my bad. I definitely want to apologize to all you guys for that. For those of you who are watching this live right now on Facebook, you're actually not going to be able to see what I am showing. That's only going to last for about 5 minutes, so please don't disconnect, and we're definitely going to have some commentary that hopefully you find to be interesting. But, and I'm pretty sure, I don't even know how many are watching live right now. I can't see my phone. But anyways, but if you're interested in seeing these pictures, this video will be posted sometime tonight or possibly tomorrow morning. So you can definitely see those pictures there. It'll be posted on YouTube as well as Twitter, Facebook, and basically all of our social media accounts here. But anyways, here you can see a riot police officer firing a tear gas canister, right, toward anti-government demonstrators during a protest in Hong Kong's tourism. This is, of course, according to, for those of you who can see it, the description there below. And we have seen reports here of live fire. Here you see a protester who, according to this, is being detained by riot police, obviously in a pretty violent manner. They've got him hogtied here. It's not as violent as some of the other things we've seen, but definitely some violence here. Here you see violence on a protester's side. Anti-government protester walks past a burning barrier outside Hong Kong, and you can see that this is something that he seems to have caused. He certainly looks like he is the terrorist type, shall we say, right? Or the freedom fighter type, I guess. A one man's terrorist is certainly another man's freedom fighter. And in this case, I am certainly not saying I disagree with the Hong Kong protesters. A first aid volunteer kicks a tear gas canister during an anti-government protest. Got a few more pictures here. Here's a pedestrian arguing with riot police. There's been protesters found dead. There's been protesters who have been found washed up in, on the beaches of Taiwan and of a few other islands out there that are actually not associated with the Chinese government. There's been plenty of reports and actually videos even. You can see some of these videos on Louder with Crowder. I don't know any other news websites that have currently been showing it, but there's been quite a bit showing it of straight up murder, right? These cops just going out and outright killing protesters with little to no discretion whatsoever. Here's another picture here of riot police with an anti-government protester. in Mong Kong, which I guess is in Hong Kong. I'm not too familiar with how all that works as far as, you know, the different areas of the city. Here's an article here that actually is describing not only the Hong Kong protests, but little did you know, protests are actually going on pretty much everywhere. Yeah, we are in an interesting time right now. There is mass protest in Lebanon. There's obviously still quite a bit of stuff going on in Venezuela. We've got protests going on in Iraq. Obviously, there's been quite a bit of unrest here in the United States and in France, of course, although we don't really hear too much about that anymore because it's just been something that's so constant that we don't really care about. And to be fair, it's not as bad here as it is in other places, right? It's not like Antifa is being murdered by the government, or the, you know, counter to Antifa is being murdered by the government, or that they're even killing each other yet. Although it's going to get to that point, I definitely think we've already had at least one legitimate terrorist attack and one attempted legitimate terrorist attack on the part of Antifa. But nonetheless, I digress. Here we see from CNBC, mass protests grip Hong Kong, Lebanon, Chile, and Iraq as unrest spreads across the world. This was actually written in October 26th, so about, what is that, 2 days ago at this point? Yeah, 2 days ago. I can't find the author's name, but I'll find it here in just a minute. Mohammed Emin Kanik. There you go. Mohammed Kanik is the author here of this article. In Hong Kong, it was a complicated extradition dispute involving a murder suspect. In Beirut, it was a proposed tax on the popular WhatsApp messenger service. And in Chile, it was a 4-cent hike in subway fares. Recent weeks have seen mass protests and clashes erupt in far-flung places triggered by seemingly minor actions that each came to be seen as the final straw. The demonstrations are fueled by local grievances but reflect worldwide frustrations at growing inequality, corrupt elites, and broken promises. Now, I do want you to know that this is a little bit of an opinion piece, and there are certain pieces in here that I'm going to be disagreeing with, definitely. But I do think it is a good piece. Wrote from the point of view of somebody who I think definitely appears to have some leftist leanings here, but that's perfectly fine. I think leftists and people on the right, rightist doesn't really sound correct, but nonetheless, I think people on the right and people on the left can definitely come together over thinking that it is complete and total ridiculousness for this, you know, for these protests to be happening everywhere, not because of the protests themselves, but because, you know, there's violence in the streets, people are obviously dying and being oppressed, and it's something that I think we can all agree that human freedom is a good thing, right? Nonetheless, where past waves, excuse me, I actually read the wrong paragraph here anyways. Recent weeks have seen mass protests and clashes erupt in far-flung places triggered by seemingly minor actions. Nope, I already read that. Where past waves of protests, like the 2011 Arab Spring or the rallies that accelerated the breakup of the Soviet Union, took aim at dictatorships, the latest demonstrations are rattling elected governments. The unrest on 3 continents, coupled with man, that is just ridiculous. My apologies. One more time. The unrest on 3 continents, coupled with the toxic dysfunction in Washington and London, raises fresh concerns over whether the liberal international order, with free elections and free markets, can deliver on its promises. I promise you guys I know how to read at a level that is higher than that of a 2-year-old. I can assure you of that. Whether or not you can assure me of that is obviously a different question, but nonetheless, we continue forward. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese people poured into the streets after the government floated a new tax on WhatsApp on the heels of an austerity package that came in response to an increasingly severe fiscal crisis. The protest rapidly escalated into an indictment of the entire post-Civil War order, in which a sectarian power-sharing arrangement has transformed former warlords and other elites into a permanent political class. In the 3 decades since the war ended, the same leaders have used patronage networks to get themselves reelected again and again, even as the government has failed to reliably provide basic services like electricity, water, and trash collection. Small bit of background here. For those of you who may not be aware, Lebanon is a very, very dysfunctional country and has been for a very long time. The reason Lebanon is such a dysfunctional country is because it was basically the area where a whole bunch of Christian Muslims were kind of stuck, but also where a bunch of secular Arab Muslims are, sorry, I said that incorrectly. Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs, right? So let me restart that a little bit. With a whole bunch of Christian Arabs were basically forced into this area, and a whole bunch of secular but also still Muslim Arabs were forced into this area as well. And eventually that combined with heavy Druze populations, the fact that they were stuck between the Assad regime in Syria and the nation of Israel, which is of course the most heated topic in the Middle East, period, and the fact that they were caught numerous times in disputes between the Arabs and Israelis, as well as the Americans and the Soviet Union, has led Lebanon to be basically a dumpster fire constantly. Those of you who are familiar with Israeli politics at all would actually know that it's been quite frequently brought up in Israeli politics that Lebanon is a dumpster fire and it's right across the border. What are we going to do about this? In fact, Israel once had control of the two counties or provinces or whatever they would actually call it in Lebanon, but the two lower states, if you will, of Lebanon were used to be under military control of Israel to try and go in there and deal with Hezbollah and a few Palestinian terrorist groups. And it's just been a constant problem for years and years and years and years and years. But recently, it's actually had somewhat peaceful governance. The reason being, there seemed to be kind of like they said, a status quo established. But it wasn't a status quo of very good people, as tends to be the case in the Middle East. It was kind of like Saddam Hussein's government or the Assad regime in Syria, in that it was dictatorial people. It was the warlords who were fighting in the first place. Hezbollah still is in Lebanon to this day. Christians are still mistreated in Lebanon to this day. They're constantly wanting to fight with Israel to this day. They have relationships with terrorist groups like Hamas to this day. And it's obviously just been a very big problem. Obviously, and I think something that Americans tend to forget, the people who live under dumpster fire regimes don't enjoy it, right? And I think we tend to lump all these people into like, oh, it's dumpster fire over there. Everybody must just be out, for themselves, and it's all anarchy and everything's terrible and all that kind of stuff. It tends actually not to be the case. Most people are actually pretty normal, and they want a normal life, and they want a good life, and they get pretty fed up when you have dictatorial regimes or completely useless regimes or regimes that are constantly stuck in a deadlock or all that kind of stuff, when you have these kinds of dumpster fire countries. And really, it's only a matter of time before something happens. Unfortunately, a lot of times the best thing that can happen is either a complete and total change of heart of the nation to lead to some sort of democracy, which virtually never happens, or actually an incredibly cruel dictatorial leader who can keep the peace. That kind of sucks. But for the most part, most Middle Eastern nations have been most peaceful and had most prosperity for the most amount of people when dictators were in charge. See Saudi Arabia or Saddam Hussein's Iraq if you do not believe me. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and continue here with this article. The protests rapidly escalated into an indictment of the entire post-Civil War order, which I already read. Man, that's the second time I've done that. I am failing just incredibly super hard today. A similar story has unfolded in Iraq since the 2003 U.S.-led invasion, where a government that distributes power and top offices among Shiites and minority Sunnis and Kurds has calcified into a corrupt stasis, with parties haggling over ministries as services and infrastructure fall into further ruin despite the country's considerable oil wealth. Thieves, thieves, protesters in both countries chanted this week. Also, something that's not mentioned in this article, but that is also happening in this area that is important, is obviously Israel is having tons of turmoil at the moment. They're about to have the third election that they've had this year because they can't come to an agreement on a unity government, which for those of you who don't know how the parliamentary system works, I'm not going to go into it too much, but basically you elect like 4 or 5 or 6 different parties because you're voting for individual parties rather than people. So, and you get like a percentage based off of how many votes you got. So maybe one group gets 40% and another group gets 30 and 20 and so on, right? And you have to actually try to create a unity government that has a majority of the people with you to form the government. Israel was unable to do that after their first election this year, so they had a re-election, and they were unable to do it again, so they are going to have another re-election. Could you imagine, electing the president in the Congress, and then electing the president of the Congress again about 2 months later, And then about 2 months later, you have to elect the president of the Congress again. It's not good, right? Things are very tumultuous in that region. Bibi Netanyahu is about to be charged with fraud. His wife is about to be charged with fraud. If he loses the election and is not prime minister, it's going to happen because right now he can't be charged with fraud as the prime minister. Also in Syria, big problems. The Kurds have recently just been basically betrayed by the United States. The United States completely moved out, but decided that they were only going to move out in, I don't know what the way, what's the word there? Progressive, right? In a progressive fashion. We're not just leaving outright. Turkey led a massive invasion basically exactly when we decided we were going to have the vast majority of our troops out, which is definitely not coincidental. A lot of people think it was planned. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. There's no way that the American government didn't know it would happen. So regardless of if it was planned, they definitely knew that this was going to happen as a result. And so there's just turmoil in this entire region right now, right? And of course, this is going to go into the fact that we have even more protests in China as well. I mean, there's stuff going on everywhere, right? We're in a very interesting time right now. A lot of people are just fed up with a lot of stuff, and the Brexit's still going on. The whole thing, and I mean, I don't know. It's just interesting how so many things. When it rains, it pours, right? When it rains, it pours, and a hurricane pours. It doesn't just pour like a bad rain. Quote, massive economic mismanagement coupled with spiraling corruption has pauperized large segments of Arab people, end quote, says Fawaz Gerges, a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. Quote, it is no wonder that millions of Arabs are fed up, end quote. The protests in both countries target governments that are close to Iran and backed by its heavily armed local allies, raising fears of a violent backlash. Nearly 200 Iraqis have been killed in recent clashes with security forces, and supporters of the Iran-backed Hezbollah militant group have brawled with protesters in Beirut. Quote, there is no magic bullet or easy answer to the severe crisis of the governance in Arab lands, Gerges said. The struggle will be fierce and long and costly, but there is no turning back, end quote. Basically said all I want to say on that, but, like I said, it's not just this region, it's a lot of different regions. And there's even regions that I'm not talking about. There's protests happening in Iran. There's political intrigue all the time in Saudi Arabia. It's pretty much constant. And I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. There is and has been since 2015 a new alliance of sorts forming between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And they're easily the two most powerful countries in the region. So I do wonder if out of this chaos, that could come, but even stronger than it would have originally, which of course would be incredibly bad news for Iran. And could potentially be incredibly bad news for everybody for numerous reasons. It could cause could cause lots of world war. It could cause a uniting between the three world religions, which is something we definitely don't want. That's right. That's the whole Vatican ideal that we've all been talking about here on the Watchdog since day one. But that is something that is definitely. I'm not saying that it's planned or orchestrated by any means, because I do think that people are kind of stupid and they're not actually smart enough to orchestrate these kinds of crazy things. I do, however, think that the powerful will get more powerful as a result of all of this turmoil, because that tends to happen. If they're not uprooted, they just end up clamping down and becoming stronger than they were before. Is Bibi Netanyahu going to be charged with fraud? Probably not. Are the warlords in Lebanon going to be overthrown? Probably not. Is Assad going anywhere? Probably not. Right? Are we going to see anything happen in Iraq that's going to change the status quo there? Probably not. But we are going to see turmoil cause deeper divides, cause a lot of people to be killed, cause a lot of people to get arrested, cause there to be more hatred and animosity between everybody, and potentially lead to greater crackdowns and more powerful tyrannical governments than what were already there in the first place. And actually, to be fair, as much as I hate to admit it, I kind of would see the same thing happening in China. I don't think the Hong Kong protesters have got a chance in hell. I mean, Hong Kong doesn't have an army. And you think America is going to put boots on the ground to defend Hong Kong? You're tripping. You're completely tripping. You think the UN's going to do it? You think NATO's going to do it? You think that the United Nations, the European Union's going to do it? You think Russia's going to tell their buddy there in China, hey, you can't do that? I don't think so. It's just not. You think North Korea's got something to say about it? Funny, right? Funny. It shouldn't. I mean, who? If China honestly decides they're going into Hong Kong and they're just not going to care, they're taking it up, or taking it over, right? And let's say they're even somewhat reasonable about it, right? They put it under a military occupation, but it's a military occupation kind of analogous to what the British did in the Falkland Islands or what the Israelis did in southern Lebanon, right? Where it's not actually terribly tyrannical. You really think anybody's going to object to that? Of course not. Of course not. Hong Kong's days as a somewhat autonomous region are numbered. And they're going to lose this. And I hate to say it, but I think we all know it's true. Anyways, speaking of China, this article now goes into talking about China. So let's do that. Hong Kong protests erupted in early June after the semi-autonomous city passed an extradition bill that put residents at risk of being sent to China's judicial system. At one point, protesters said they had brought 2 million people into the streets. Authorities were forced to drop the extradition proposal, which was triggered by the need to resolve the status of a murder suspect wanted for killing his pregnant girlfriend in Taiwan. But by then, the movement had snowballed to include demands for full democracy in the form of direct elections for the city's top leader. Since China took control of Hong Kong from Britain in 1997, which was one of the dumbest decisions Britain's ever done, but who's surprised that lowercase Britain is making retarded decisions, right? I mean, definitely not me. The city's leaders have been selected by an elite committee made up mostly of pro-Beijing tycoons. Local councillors and half of the Asian's financial center's legislature are directly elected, but the other half are chosen by representatives from its finance, tourism, catering, accounting, and other industries, which adds to the public discontent over stifled promises of democracy. Sorry, I read that kind of stupidly, but hopefully you guys understood what I'm saying. If not, obviously, those of you who can see this not live, you can read it. Underlying the Hong Kong protest movement are rising fears about China's tightening grip on the city and worries that Beijing is reneging on promises not to meddle with Hong Kong's Western-style civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and an independent judiciary. You don't say. I mean, that's just absolutely crazy that when Xi Jinping, the guy who literally has concentration camps out for 2 of the world's major religions, as well as one of China's most popular New Age religions, the guy who is trying to make everybody forget that Tiananmen Square ever happened, the guy who's signing deals saying that he can persecute Christians at the behest of the Catholic Church and wanting to have the dragonfly thing that is just making sure that nobody can actually look up any of the things that he's doing wrong. The guy who's banning Winnie the Pooh because it was making fun of him. How surprising that that guy is going to renege on the promises to this semi-autonomous region that they might have civil liberties. I'm shocked, I say. You know what I mean? It's like Fry when he's like, I'm shocked. Well, not that shocked, right? And it's like, I mean, it's not like he's the only one, too. It's not like Xi Jinping is the first president in the history of China to be tyrannical and decide he just wants what's best for the Communist Party or potentially himself. I mean, what is it? Deng Xiaoping, I think was his name, was terrible. Absolutely terrible. And Mao Zedong was horrible. Mao Zedong is the worst killer that we actually know of, at least, of all time. Somewhere between like 40 and 78 million people. I think I've even heard numbers as high as 80 and 90 million people. It's completely ridiculous how many people he murdered. And yet, somehow, we were all under the impression that China was going to honor this agreement, right? I mean, I think the people who first made this agreement back in 1997 were stupid. I mean, you need to, it's like the, what's the guy? Neville Chamberlain, right? Neville Chamberlain making the deal with Adolf Hitler. It's like, well, are you a retard? Do you not see what this person is doing? Do you not see how many deals he's broken? Do you not see how he's treating the people in his population that he disapproves of? Which, granted, Neville Chamberlain had no idea that a Holocaust was going to happen. Nobody had any idea that a Holocaust was going to happen. But it's not like in 1938 Hitler was super kind to Jews, right? It's not like it hadn't already been established that Hitler didn't like Jews and crippled people and gypsies and all that other kind of stuff by 1938. I mean, he called Jesse Owens an animal in 1936 and stormed out because he was mad that the Americans decided to put this animal against his human beings. He said it wasn't fair, right? That's a real, actual event that happened, which, by the way, after that, he ended up writing Jesse Owens, which is an interesting twist on everything. But nonetheless, right, it's how I feel about this 1997 agreement with Hong Kong. It's like, what were you expecting? Okay? You know, you knew that I was, the poem, you knew I was a snake before I brought you in or whatever. You know, I don't know exactly how it goes. But it's just, people need to not be stupid. You can't capitulate to evil, ever. Evil is evil, and it will take advantage of you by its very nature because it's evil. It has no care for morals or ethics. Thus is the nature of it. Morality and ethics, by their very definition, are good, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I'm beating a dead horse at this point. Let's continue. Protesters also fear China's technologically powered authoritarianism. Wearing masks to conceal their identities, they have cut down smart lampposts and smashed surveillance cameras. They worry about artificial intelligence-powered facial recognition surveillance systems capturing their biometric data and sending it for processing by Chinese technology giants to track and identify them. By the way, let nobody ever say that Alex Jones was a crazy person, because the man predicted this some 20 years ago, and I know that he said a lot of crazy things, and I know that a lot of times he has been kind of, out of his mind. He seems like he's just an entertainer, right? Tinfoil hat kind of dude. But consistently, the man has been shown to have an uncanny ability to see what is going to happen in the future. So I just want to point that out. I'm not necessarily an endorser of Alex Jones anymore because he's very Trumpist, and I'm not a fan of that. But let's just be perfectly clear, right? And it's not just him either. A lot of the people who were back in the day talking about this kind of stuff have been proven correct the longer that we're going on here. Nonetheless, kind of already said everything we want to be saying there. China, unfortunately, is just something that I guess we're going to have to deal with here in America if we want to continue supporting the companies that we support. Which, to a certain extent, I will say is the American people's fault, right? You as an individual American may not necessarily be to blame, but the chances are that you as an individual American probably are to blame. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you're the ones who go to, shop at Apple, who go to shop at, Disney, who go to, or buy Disney products, rather, right? Yeah, I can technically say shop at Apple. They have their Apple stores. You guys are the ones who are going to, support social justice warrior people like Colin Kaepernick, which leads people like Steve Kerr and LeBron James to be like, no, you know what? We're going to be supportive of China because it's not very woke not to be supportive of China, right? And you guys are going to be the ones to continue to watch the NBA afterwards, right? That's the thing about a capitalist nation and also a democratic nation, and also we can extend this even to religion when you have congregationalist religion like Christianity, is it really does rely on the populace. You're the ones who choose to buy the product and do business with this company. You're the ones who decide to elect these politicians. You're the ones who decide to watch the news that lies to you, right? And that may not necessarily be true for everybody who is watching this program, but for some people it might, right? For some people it might. I kind of doubt it a little bit, considering just the how little people actually do watch this program. I think, we have a few videos that go over 100 views, but nothing too big. And so I imagine the vast majority of people who are watching this are probably going to be people who are watching it because they agree with it. But with that being said, we all know, right, somebody who's going and purchasing products for a company that is doing something that they disapprove of. And I'm not saying boycott every company that's doing something that you disapprove of either. I'm just simply saying that for a lot of these things, we do need to understand this is the American consumer or voter or worshiper or whatever it happens to be. It's the Americans' fault, right? Because we are the ones who consume and give them our dollar and thus incentivize them to sell a certain product or to sell the product a certain way or to do their business practices in a certain way, and etc. Quite frankly, I don't think that any market on this planet will ever compare to the American market because it's insatiable. And so I think if the American market decided it wasn't going to purchase Apple products or Google products or any of these other products as a result of this sort of capitulation to China, I don't think they would. They either wouldn't survive or they would stop capitulating to China. That's how that would work. And I know everybody wants to say, yeah, but 1.3 billion. Yeah, but I have a feeling that 1.3 billion probably doesn't spend as much money collectively as the top 1% of the United States, let alone the top 10 or 50%, right? We spend a lot of money in this country. We live very luxuriously. We're incredibly prosperous. There is nobody on the planet right now as far as pure buying power that comes even close to the United States. And they probably never will, honestly, precisely because of their dictatorial tendencies. It's really not that possible. Nonetheless, I want to continue on this article because there's one other country we're going to talk about, which is Chile. Unrest in wealthy democratic Chile. On Friday, an estimated 1 million Chileans, yes, 1 million Chileans, filled the streets of the capital, Santiago, more than ever took to the streets during the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, the democratic governances that came after him. The protests were sparked by the subway fare hike, but soon morphed into a mass government against inequality in one of Latin America's wealthiest countries. At least 19 people have been killed as protesters have clashed with police in recent days. Isn't it interesting that virtually none of these are talked about? I mean, really, the only reason the Hong Kong protesters are talked about is because independent journalists forced it to be talked about, right? The only thing they ever talk about, really, is I think sometimes they'll occasionally talk about protests in Israel, and then they'll talk about the protests of people like Antifa because they agree with them, right? But nobody ever wants to talk about people who are actually protesting in other countries. I don't know why. It certainly would sell very well in our sensationalist media culture, but, you know, don't want you to be informed, I guess. Protesters tried to force their way onto the grounds of Chile's legislature Friday, provoking an evacuation of the building. Police fired tear gas to fend off hundreds of demonstrators on the perimeter as some lawmakers and administrative staff hurried out of the legislative building, which is the port city of Valparaiso. I don't know how you say that. Valparaiso? Probably Valparaiso. Anyways. Marta Lagos, head of the Latino Barometro, a non-profit survey group in Chile, said the protesters have exposed the shortcomings of the country's political system. Quote, there is a failure of the system of political parties in its ability to represent society, end quote, Lagos said. Just one moment, I just got to scroll here on the article, and the internet is not being cooperative. Struggling to contain the strife, President Sebastian Piñera's administration announced increases in the minimum wage, raised minimum pensions by 20%, and rolled back the subway fare increases. He put a 9.2% increase in electricity prices on hold until the end of next year, but with analysis predicting his resignation and fresh elections, the consequences of that move could fall to his successor. And let's be perfectly clear, they're going to end up causing mass consequences and bankrupting this country, just as they did in Venezuela, and just as they do in every country that decides that they are going to have more socialist governance as a way to combat inequality or perceived inequality, because in some cases it's not even real inequality. It may or may not be in Chile. I'm not terribly familiar with Chile, but regardless, the fact of the matter is, the fact that there's a government-mandated increase in electricity prices that he can put a hold on is part of what's causing the problem, right? The fact that this person is able to just raise the minimum wage here on a whim, right, and raise the minimum pensions on a whim is part of the problem. The goal of an economy should not be to give everybody more money. The goal of an economy should be to make the money that you have worth more, right? And how do you make the money that you have worth more? Well, by numerous means, but a few of them, you own the means of production. You make money rarer, right? You don't continuously print it out constantly. You make sure you have a functioning faith-based economy. By faith-based economy, I don't mean religious, but I mean people have faith in the buying power of their currency, right? Because that way they're more frugal with said currency. If you have faith that you can get a lot of things for a $100 bill, well, then you might be more frugal with that $100 bill. Whereas if you can't get a lot of things with a $100 bill, if maybe you're only going to get a few Big Macs, well, then you might want to save that, because as it turns out, if you only buy a few Big Macs, you ain't got much. You got a meal for one time, right? And you want to continue to save that money and stockpile. You start becoming a little bit more skeptical of the buying power that you have as a consumer, and etc. And I'm far from an economist, trust me on that, but this is pretty basic stuff that you are learning in high school, right? Actually, interestingly enough, speaking of South Park, since we talked about South Park in this, there's actually a South Park episode that explains this, though it's kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit, sacrilegious, as South Park tends to be, so if you're not into that kind of thing. I don't like any of their episodes that get into religion, but that's because I'm a religious person, and if you're into that kind of thing, then whatever. Go ahead and do it. Doesn't really matter, obviously. They're pretty funny shows regardless. But it very well explains the nature of the faith-based economic system. And, it's a very intuitive program all around, honestly. But that episode in particular. Nonetheless, I'm getting a little bit off topic here. There's another thing here about Catalan protests. Catalan protests have taken a violent turn. For years, Catalan separatists have held peaceful, festive marches, but the movement took a violent turn last week when protests erupted over the imprisonment of 9 leaders who led a bid for independence from Spain in 2017. The failed attempt left the separatist movement rudderless, with 12 of its leaders arrested, most of the rest fleeing the country, including former Catalan regional president Charles Puigdemont. I think it's Puigdemont. I don't know. New activist collectives have emerged in their places, including one calling itself the Tsunami Democratic, which uses its own app and encrypted messages to call for civil disobedience. In one of its first calls to protest after the October 31st Supreme Court ruling. October 31st? Must have been last year. Anyways. But one of the first calls to protest after the October 31st Supreme Court ruling, jailing the 9 leaders. This is actually why I didn't really want to read this, is because I know little to nothing about the whole Catalina thing. Turned into a massive siege. Hang on, let me restart that. But one of its first calls to protest after the October 31st Supreme Court ruling, jailing the leaders, turned into a massive siege of Barcelona's international airport, with rioters clashing with police late into the night. That's got to be a typo, actually, because the way they're describing that is as if it just happened. And October 31st isn't here yet. So, I don't know. Anyways, this group has borrowed some of its tactics and rhetoric from the Hong Kong protesters, and protesters in both places have staged demonstrations in support of one another. Though most Hong Kong protesters have been careful not to push for independence from China, one of Winnie Jinping's red lines. Winnie the Pooh Bear up in here has red lines. So scary. He's such a loser. That one movement, is struggling against domination by one party, China, while the other is rising up against a European democracy, is a distinction that has been lost in the tear gas. Although I think calling Spain a liberal democracy, it says European democracy, but it's certainly not a democracy in the way that we would like to understand it. I mean, Spain has quite the history of being pretty nasty to basically everybody. So, little bit of an exaggeration there on the part of the article writer, but nonetheless, as you guys can see here, quite a bit of garbage happening pretty much everywhere, actually. We have Catalonia, we have, just talking about these, Lebanon, Iraq, Israel, Syria, right? Things going on in Hong Kong, obviously. I'm sure the Yellow Vest protests are still going on. Antifa's still going on here. There's just protests basically everywhere. Everything is just going to hell in a handbasket all at the same time, and everything sucks, and nothing is good. And that's just the timeline we're in currently, right? You could write an alternate history about this timeline in 100 years, but it wouldn't be very interesting because we live in the most interesting timeline, right? I mean, things are really, really weird right now. But nonetheless, it's just the way things are, I guess. Man, 52 minutes. Jeez, I didn't get to talk about hardly anything except for these protests. I still got 8 minutes, that's fine. So, one thing I do want to address here before we are done, I did watch the Adam Green versus Michael Brown debate on whether or not the Zionists are trying to take over the world, and, the no-hide laws are going to behead Christians in the streets and all this other kind of stuff. It really wasn't actually a debate. It was more of a discussion, right? It wasn't formal or anything like that. They were just on Adam Green's No More News channel, going back and forth as to whether or not they believed that this was going to occur. I also watched the broadcast that Adam Green did with Israeli News Live's Stephen Ben-Nun afterwards. And I gotta say, it was an interesting conversation, definitely, between Adam Green and Michael Brown. I'd certainly recommend watching it. It's on both Ask Dr. Brown. And actually, no, it's not on Ask Dr. Brown anymore. Sorry, YouTube actually took it down from the Ask Dr. Brown YouTube channel, even though Adam Green's actually is still up and has significantly more views and likes and things like that, by the way. Which, by the way, I'm not saying, just to point out, I'm not saying that they should be taken down. I am, however, saying that Zionist conspiracy theorists, is it not interesting that you have like 10 times more views than Michael Brown does, and yet your video doesn't get taken down, but his does. I'm just saying, clearly the Jews taking over the world aren't doing a very good job. Anyways, so So it was an interesting discussion. You can definitely find it at least on No More News, and I'm pretty sure some other YouTube channels have published it as well. I think anybody who watches it objectively, regardless of what position you came in originally, right? I think you're going to have to agree that Michael Brown won the debate. And there's a pretty obvious reason why Michael Brown won the debate, and it's because the Noahide laws are not going to be used to behead Christians. At least not anywhere that is not Israel, right? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as we've seen in China, the Vatican is very willing to sign deals that give it sole religious authority in a certain country at the behest or at the sacrifice of, some certain political powers and authorities to certain less than savory governments, right? In the case of the Chinese deal, the Chinese government gets to appoint the bishops, that the Pope, of course, obviously gets to appoint as well. They're going to come to a conclusion together on the bishops of China. The Chinese government gets to edit the Bible as they see fit, and all Christian organizations that don't go under the wing of the Catholic Church, since it's the only legitimate church in town, are not going to be considered legitimate believers. And in fact, Cardinal Joseph Zen of Beijing, a member of the Catholic Church and a member of the College of Cardinals, has warned against this plan because he says that, traditionalist Catholics and Catholics who refuse to have their Bible edited, and any Christian who is not a Catholic, as well as Muslims and Jews and etc., have just basically been sold out by the Pope as, not legitimate religious organizations. And the Chinese government's always going to be, be able to sit there and say, hey, no, see, we offered a peace offering, if you will, right? We offered the dove, what do they call that? The olive branch. And you guys refused to accept it, so we have a right to throw you in jail. And the Chinese government, or the Catholic Church rather, is completely okay with that. I think that is going to be a precedent for the Catholic Church to do this in the future. And I also think that in Israel, they are starting to have a very big problem with persecution of Jewish groups that do not line up with the mainstream thought, right? Orthodox groups that are wanting to go to the temple are persecuted by the secularists, as are Haredi Orthodox groups, which are the ultra-Orthodox. The Haredi themselves, though, are also persecuting others because they persecute Karaite Jews, which are Jews who disagree with the Talmud's validity, but just say that the Tanakh is the only revealed scripture, right? And Messianic Jews, which is Jewish Christians, right? So, and the Messianic Jews are actually getting the worst of this in that they have zero political representation whatsoever, and they're not even classified legally as Jews because the rabbinate is actually who is in control of who's classified as a Jew and who is not, and the rabbinate does not consider those who follow Jesus to be Jews, even though those who follow Jesus are, of course, doing so because they believe that he is the Jewish Messiah, right? So it's not like they're abandoning, at least in their own mind, their religion. And if you were going to use any other Messianic group, which Lubavitch, for example, right, is a Messianic group who believes that the Rebbe Lubavitch was actually the Messiah, they're considered Jews to be fine by the rabbinate, but for whatever reason, the rabbinate's not a fan of the Messianics. And considering that Noahide laws are certainly going to become something that is very popular and very valuable to the ultra-Orthodox, the more power they get, which they are certainly getting right now. Bibi Netanyahu, as much as I love the guy, has capitulated to the ultra-Orthodox far too much. He lets them be exempt from military service. He's let them have the control of who's a Jew and who's not. He's let them have control over marriage. He's let them have control over whether or not certain people can be admitted into the country. I mean, he capitulates to them far too often, and he's even radicalized them far more than a lot of them were already radicalized. I myself kind of actually identify with the political ideology of Meir Kahane, and I can tell you Meir Kahane would probably not be too fond of his descendants, politically speaking, right now, because they've even radicalized even farther than he was, and I say that because he was considered a radical at his time. And so I certainly see, you could see something where the Vatican comes into Israel and in a sense endorses all of the persecution of those who might be Christian but refuse to go under the Catholic wing, which would include virtually all Messianic Jews. Basically, those who are not Arabs but are Christians in the land of Israel would start to become persecuted. And so with that, I thought that there was a certain level of truth to what Adam Green was saying in this debate, that Noahide laws will be used to behead Christians. I think that's probably true. In Israel, though. Only in Israel. I don't think that's going to be used for the rest of the world, because the group that is going to be doing the endorsing of these tyrannical governments is the group who did so in China, right? The Vatican. And we're going to get a lot more into this in this week's episode of Unapologetics, because it is going to go, obviously, into topics that are not socio-political, but are more deeply theological and religious. But we've seen examples of this just over the last weekend with the Pope saying that, or not with the Pope, but with, it was with the Pope, saying that Jesus was not God. And saying that pagan rites, if they were done in a Catholic worship service, were just worships of God just as well as any Catholic rites were. And he actually went and, I can't remember when exactly it was, I think it was within the last month though, went and dedicated a Mormon temple along with the Mormon elders who were there, right? And the president of the Mormon church was also there. So we see him kind of going around here wanting to further his political influence, further his religious influence, and it's ironic that he's doing all of this around the same time that we're having this debate, when everybody's saying, no, it's the Jews, no, it's the Jews, no, it's the Jews, no, it's the Jews. I also don't find it coincidental, by the way, that the spearhead of this Zionist conspiracy theory's resurgence happens to be a Catholic scholar. Call me conspiratorial, but I think since we have somebody who is outright, right, not in the shadows, not in the deep state, not doing all the secrecy, who is outright, with their want to control the world, with their belief that they're the universal and only church, with their belief that everybody should be united, with their capitulation to the Chinese government, and even endorsing of it in order to increase its own power, right? I think that it would be within their best interests to throw a red herring out there and say, well, for those of you who are kind of interested, or not interested, who are kind of like seeing what we're doing here and pointing out the negatives of it, we'll give you the Jews. No, see here, look, it's the Jews. Bob Iger's Jewish, you know. Anybody know he converted to being a Catholic? I'll bet you forgot about that, right? Now, I'm not saying all Catholics are evil or conspiratorial or anything like that, but I think the vast majority of non-Catholics can agree that the church hierarchy itself, I mean, it outright admits it. Catholic means universal, right? And I know a lot of people think that I'm conspiratorial in this regard, but I think you're kind of high, to be perfectly honest with you, if you think somebody who calls himself God, and in place of God, and infallible, and calls his church the universal church, and tries to unite all the different religions under his banner, and makes deals with other people that makes the people who worship his God not legitimate unless they are under his banner, right? I think that that's worrisome. And I think it's a little bit more worrisome when people who are actually relatively sharp and who pick up on conspiracies like this go into these rabbit trails of like, oh, I get this secret knowledge that nobody else knows. The Jews and their Kabbalah are going to take it over. When the Vatican does it outright and in your face. They don't hide it. Like I said, Catholic means universal. It's a doctrine of the Pope that the Pope is infallible, or a doctrine of the Catholic Church, rather, that the Pope is infallible. We see these dedications. As a matter of fact, here, I'm just going to pull up LifeSite News. LifeSite News is a Catholic news organization. So not only is it mainstream and not conspiratorial, it's actually Vatican, right? And here's what it says here. You can see it on the screen here. For those of you who are watching it live, you can't see it, but it's going to be on YouTube in a few hours, so you can see it there. If pagan rites are part of the Amazon Synod, they are still worship of God. That is from the Vatican. That is from the Vatican, right? I mean, this is their position. And again, this is not conspiratorial newspapers. Pope Francis, Christianity welcomes pagans, but they must reject idolatry, he says. And then what does he go on to do? Excuse me. He goes on to accept a pagan statue and allow people to worship it, and even calls it Our Lady of the Amazon. And it's a naked pregnant lady, for crying out loud, made out of a wooden statue. Right? And you know he doesn't believe that. You know he doesn't believe that that's actually the Lady of the Amazon. But he wants the pagans to be down with him. And this is outright and in your face. I mean, this is what is going on. And it's not like we're new to this, right? The Jesuits have been doing this kind of stuff for years. It's the reason they exist. They're the Counter-Reformation. Look it up. Go on Wikipedia. I'm being straight up. Go on Wikipedia. It's the most general knowledge you can find. Go on any Catholic Answers or any sort of Catholic website you can find. Go on Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica, right? Or literally anything else at all. They will tell you the Jesuits' sole purpose is Counter-Reformation. It is not like this stuff is new. Okay? People have been fully aware for a very long time that the Catholic Church is a real-life conspiratorial organization that actually does like to do stuff in the shadows, and sometimes, and a lot of times, even out of the shadows. They really are interested in things like a New World Order. They really do think they have somebody who's in place of God. And it blows my mind when people follow these rabbit trails like Zionists and Illuminati and Freemason, right? And other nonsense like this that goes absolutely nowhere when there is a group out there that is telling you to your face, yeah, we're that guy you're worried about. And everybody's just like, well, guess we'll move on to the next group here. Don't gotta trust the people who are outright telling you what they're out to do, right? But nonetheless, we'll get a lot more into this in the next episode of Unapologetics because there's a lot of theological things, a lot of theological points I want to make. And right now, obviously, we're only speaking about this from a secular and political perspective. I also want to get into the fact that, there's this here and the fact that the Pope rejected the divinity of God, the fact that he was, sitting there dedicating a temple, a Mormon temple, right? So there's a lot of interesting things that are going to be on the Unapologetics in regards to the Catholic Church and their New World Order tendencies. In fact, just to give you an idea of some articles that'll be there, Vatican forcefully denies claim Pope Francis said Jesus was not God, and we'll see quite a bit of interesting arguments as to see why that's not true, because the Pope himself refuses to go against it, by the way. And a few other things there, but like I said, I don't want to get too into it. Last two things I want to talk about here today. First off, I want to have you guys watch a video here. People are putting their ID, wallet, keys in their hand. Yes, Sweden is moving into the future of microchipping. For those of you who are watching this live and cannot see my screen right now, in case you're wondering, it's more conspiratorial nonsense, I'll bet he's getting this from InfoWars or something like that. NBC News, my friend. NBC News. And here's what they have to say about it. Imagine carrying just about everything you need beneath the surface of your hand. Your wallet, keys, and ID all in a microchip. That's reality in Sweden as some early adopters implant the tiny devices beneath their skin. Those of you who are watching this live, I hope you can hear this. If not, please do watch this program when it goes up on YouTube.
The jobs of tomorrow will involve technology. With Verizon Innovative Learning, every student, regardless of background, can dare to dream.
When Elias Brotberger goes to work, he doesn't need ID. And he doesn't need money. In fact, much of what he needs to get through the day is hidden right there, just below the surface, in his hand.
You like to touch it?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, weird. Yeah, it's like a grain of rice.
Yeah, a grain of rice.
Embedded in his hand is a microchip that serves as his keys, his ID, and his wallet.
Yeah, it's all in chip, so I use it like to get around the building.
Wallet. Is that not
snacks.
ridiculous?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's buy some snacks.
Exactly.
So I can't open it.
No.
Okay.
So what I need to do is I need to first blip my chip, and it will log me in, and from there I get access to
Did you see
the
that?
fridge.
Yeah, I really hope those of you who
TV
are actually
shows like
watching this, I
Black
think,
Mirror
like I
have
said, there's
imagined
only...
chips as part of a dystopian future.
So far, it looks like there's only one
Install ingrained
Cal,
procedure
shout out,
with
Cal.
local anesthetic, and
Watching
you're
this
good to
live.
go.
Watch this
In
when it
Sweden,
goes up on
the
YouTube. This dude is
microchips are
literally
already here.
purchasing
the microchip
stuff
implants
with
use the
his
same technology
hand.
that's in
Right?
contactless credit
And
cards,
there's a video
Which have
of
made
it,
cash
actually.
pretty much obsolete in Sweden.
no cash.
At this tech fair,
Here, let me
a
restart
chipping
the top.
event for those on the cutting edge, merging their
Install ingrained procedure with local anesthetic, and you're good to go.
In Sweden, the microchips are already here.
The mics. So I can't open it.
No.
Okay.
So what I need to do is I need to first blip my chip, and it will log me in, and from there I get access to the fridge.
Popular TV shows like Black Mirror have imagined chips as part of a dystopian future.
Install ingrained procedure with local anesthetic, and you're good to go.
In Sweden, the microchips are already here.
The microchip implants use the same technology that's in contactless credit cards.
Which have made cash pretty much obsolete in Sweden.
No cash.
At this tech fair, a chipping event for those on the cutting edge, merging their hands with this new technology.
A chipping event.
I thought it would be
in Sweden.
fun, right?
The
Come
process
get your
is
chips,
simple
guys.
and swift.
Let Big Brother
A
right
pinch of
into
the
your
skin,
literal
and in a
skin.
matter of seconds, the chip is inserted. The transformation is complete. As for the pain,
I barely felt it.
but even in this nation of early adopters, not everyone is racing to get chipped.
Feel less human. I will feel like a robot.
I mean, it's so much more data can go into this, when it's in your body.
There's no central registry tracking how many
I see
people
comments
are
here
chipped,
on the live
but
stream.
Biohacker
What's that
Hannes
verse
Wildwood
of the
estimates
Bible about the
between
mark of the
5,000
beast
and
in the
10,000.
hand or head?
In the future, do you think everyone's going to be chipped?
I know it's in
I
Revelation.
think it will
Let
be
me look up
voluntary,
what
but
exactly
I am
that
certainly
verse is.
convinced that millions of people will find it very, very valuable to have a smart device under their skin.
Human microchipping may be our future, but in Sweden, it's already reality. Sarah Harmon, NBC News,
Yeah,
Stockholm.
Revelation 13, 16 through 18. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. And then it says, here is wisdom, the number of his name is the number of man, that number is 666. So yeah, good call out there. This is actually happening in real life. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not on InfoWars or Israeli News Live or Natural News or anything like that. This is on NBC, and they are telling you
The president,
how
in
people are so down to have microchips embedded in their skin so that they can buy and sell and identify themselves. I mean, like, what? You know what I mean? It's like, no. And people always say, I always get these conversations with people, nah, dude, nobody's gonna microchip themselves, man. I am perfectly positive that they said that about credit cards and about letting people track your, have people, give your fingerprint to open phones and stuff like that. But guess what? We're here now. And in Sweden, we're getting microchipped. That's the way of the future, I guess. It doesn't look fun. It does not look pretty. I am 100% undown. By the way, little fun fact, I just read this thing that came up on NBC and it reminded me, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's dead. So, leader of ISIS is dead. Cool. ISIS hasn't been relevant for like 3 years, so I don't really care. But he's dead, so that's cool. Back to the point. Yeah, this is happening. This is happening right now, and isn't that ironic that it's happening in Sweden, right? Sweden, which has just been the center of all that is unholy. I laugh, but it's not funny. I mean, it's kind of terrifying. I mean, we're getting at a point, right, where George Orwell's police state actually kind of sounds pathetic, right? It's like that's all you could come up with. Dude, we got everybody fully giving up their fingerprints, their facial ID, getting chipped, getting rid of all tangible cash, putting all their money in the hands of a few collect bankers and their internet servers. We're giving more and more power to the government. People are having the ability to literally tell you what you can and cannot say and what words mean, for crying out loud, right? I mean, George Orwell, honestly, he foresaw a lot, but he did not foresee enough. You know what I'm saying? Like, things are crazy. They're out of hand. Very last thing we want to talk about here. It's going to be brief because I spent too much time talking about other things, but in the environment, a wild horse plan in Congress backed by animal welfare groups has angered advocates. So just to start this off, this is from the Nevada Independent. Hello from the Society of Environmental Journalists Conference in Colorado. I'm looking forward to meeting fellow journalists and picking up new tools for reporting on natural resource issues, says this person in a disclaimer. As Congress takes up wild horses, Nevada is front and center. With roughly 88,000 wild horses and burros that roam federal public lands, Nevada is home to more than half. And actually, it's pretty cool. As somebody who grew up in Nevada, you can see when you go on like road trips and stuff like that, a lot of times big groups of Mustangs. It's actually really cool. Most people agree the current system of managing horses is not working. Let me make something perfectly clear. Human beings should not be managing wildlife, okay? It's completely ridiculous that we actually want to go in and manage wildlife. And I know people are going to say, yeah, but we added the Mustangs and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, maybe that caused problems. But every time humans mess with the nature in any way, we just end up causing problems, okay? Right? I always love to give the wolf example because we had government-mandated wolf hunts that caused huge problems with the ecosystems because we killed all the wolves. So then we decided we'll reintroduce wolves, even though the ecosystem had already adjusted to the fact that there was no wolves because there hadn't been wolves for almost 100 years. Then we introduced the wrong wolves, causing an even bigger problem. And then in 2010, 12, and etc., and people are still talking about it now, we want to have more government-mandated wolf hunts. It's like nobody ever learns. It's like, how about you just quit messing with it, and it'll be fine, right? And it's the same thing I have to say about the horses. It's like, oh, the horses are going to cause problems. Okay, let them cause problems. The ecosystem will adjust, and then everything will be good. Nature kind of does that, right? It doesn't need your human intervention. It's perfectly fine without you. Nonetheless, though, federal land managers say the population is about 3 times the amount that is sustainable for the range, which clearly isn't true because of the fact that there's 3 times there and they're living perfectly fine. But anyways, a statistic that wild horse advocates challenge. They argue cattle have far greater effects on public land. This is obviously true, but cattle serve a purpose for human beings, so it's a pretty poor argument nonetheless. But it's not only ranchers who believe there are too many horses. Even some conservationists believe the range is too crowded with horses that trample habitat. As a result, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management routinely rounds up horses and then that live in corrals or pastures, all part of a holding system that has consumed the agency's horse budget. Yeah, horse budget. You heard that correctly. You spend taxpayer money on this garbage so that people can watch horses instead of just letting them be wild horses. Like that's ever caused a problem in the history of ever. The debate is over what to do about that system. The Senate Appropriations Committee recently approved an additional $35 million for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management's horse budget. The move was the next step in funding a plan written by 2 interests that rarely see eye to eye: ranchers and animal welfare groups. Supported by both the Humane Society and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the plan aims to decrease the horse population over time. It will increase roundups, but eventually rely on fertility control to decrease the population of the range. The Humane Society said that the plan will require a commitment to more humane roundup procedures. The current procedures are often criticized by advocacy groups, and it also cast the compromise as a win because it avoids returning to a time in the early 1900s when horses were slaughtered across the West. The plan leaves out the oldest group of wild horse advocates. We'll have this in the description below. You can definitely continue to read on it. I bring it up because I think that it's kind of ridiculous that we're in this situation again. I think human beings are notorious for a really, really, really poor ability to learn, in my opinion. Anytime that you add a species, it causes problems. That is true. But the ecosystem adjusts to the added species and eventually continues on with its merry way. If you don't believe me, then explain any animal here on North America at all, because they were all invasive species crossing over the Bering Strait last I checked, right? And they actually ended up wiping out quite a bit of the animals that were here. And yet everything went on fine. The Earth is still here. The animals are still here. The climate is still breathable. Human beings are still fine. Everything's cool, right? This notion that we need to constantly be managing our environment is nonsense. The environment is perfectly fine without us managing it. The only thing we need to manage is our own personal effect on the environment. And the best way to do that is to stop affecting the environment. Leave it alone. Let the horses do horse things. And if the horse population gets too large, guess what? They'll die off naturally. That's how it works. Some of them will starve. Some of them will be killed by predators. I mean, there's quite a bit of wolves out there, and wolves are not scared of horses. I can assure you of that, right? I'm sure a mountain lion probably would be, but a pack of wolves ain't scared of nothing. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, it's just a ridiculous thing that we always get this notion, right? Everybody wants to control the population of dogs and control the population of deer and control the population of horses, and we need to control. It's fine. It's fine. Okay? Nature does not need you, you arrogant, self-righteous, and pompous. I've been wanting to keep this a little bit cleaner, so I'm not going to cuss, but I think you know the word that comes next. It's a donkey. Representative of the Democratic Party sometimes. You know what I'm saying? Like, just leave it alone. Everything will be good. You're just going to cause more problems by going out there and, trying to maintain the horse population. And also, you're spending my taxpayer money, which, to be perfectly frank, I don't think you should be. not interested in spending money for you to neuter and spay horses or slaughter horses or corral horses or any of that sort of stuff. I think you should just let the horses be horses. And furthermore, on the pet side of things, maybe take care of your horses and we wouldn't have this kind of a problem in the first place, right? Quit letting your horses go out into the wild. Quit selling your horses all the time when they break or something along those lines, right? You only have issues with mass amounts of feral dogs and with mass amounts of feral cats and all that kind of stuff when people decide that they're going to take pets, which they never needed to do. You don't have any sort of an obligation to take pets, right? But then they take the pets, and then they decided to discard the pets or not, or lose the pets or something along those lines. They just don't take proper care of the pets, which they never had obligation to have in the first place, and now we have a problem. Don't have a problem if you didn't take any pets. Don't have a problem if you were good to your pets. But here's the problem that we have here, or your work animals, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be pets. So I'm just saying, and believe me, I'm not one of these leftist environmentalist kind of people, but I'm just saying, just leave it alone. Okay? Everything will be fine. Stop. We're fine. We're good. The horses are good. 88,000 is less than the people in Nampa. Okay? I think they'll be fine. Anyways, that's everything we got here. This weekend, for those of you who are interested in our religious content, we're going to be talking a whole lot about the Pope and everything that the Pope has been doing in his ecumenical council movements. We're also going to talk a little bit actually about an interesting prophecy that some people think Mitt Romney might be fulfilling. I do not, because I don't agree with the prophecy, but that'll be interesting. And also going to talk about Kanye West's conversion, because that is something that intrigues me quite a bit. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely check that out, coming out here soon. We're also going to have Unapologetics Light, obviously. Going to have, hopefully, an Unapologetics Light on Saturday, as well as the Unapologetics on Sunday, and of course, these Watchdogs every weekend. If you like this, definitely do like and share, not only here on the American Cynic Party Facebook page, but also on our TheCynicogue YouTube channel. Those of you who are watching this live, this will be posted in, at least, I don't know, it may end up being tomorrow morning. It kind of depends on how long my computer decides it wants to take to load this, but nonetheless, you'll be able to check that out. We have numerous social media accounts and everything here that you can go to. The TheCynicogue, obviously, subscribe there. We would love to see you there. Like the American Cynic Party page here on Facebook. We have Cynic Thought on Instagram. We have Terrestrial Earthbird on Twitter. ACP Official on Gab. And the TheCynicogue on Minds. I might have another one that I just don't recall, but it'll come to me if it comes to me. Also, those of you who are interested in discussions of a religious nature, we have the Religious Debate Club on Facebook, which so far only has 18 members, and that has turned out to not be enough to have a lot of legitimate conversations. We've had a few for sure. Some people participate. The vast majority of people don't. And thus is the nature with most groups, but when you only have 18 people, that means that those who are participating are, it's not quite as fun. So join us, please. Religious Debate Club. It'll be fun. We can debate all different kinds of religions and stuff like that. It's not about politics, so you may find it odd that I'm referencing it here on the Watchdog. But it is a debate forum group, whatever, that I personally am the admin of. So that's why I endorse it here. You guys have a great rest of your day. Shalom. I'm out of stuff to say.